This morning we're continuing with our series on different characters and great figures from the Bible. And this week I was thinking about family history. Have any of you ever studied your family history or your genealogy? This has been a personal project of my father. Years ago, he started to research the origins of our family, and he has learned many things about our past. Many interesting details. For one, he found out that my family are descendants of Vikings from Europe. That's an interesting detail. But other parts of the history of our family are a little more maybe embarrassing. Maybe there's some details are even shameful. So at times, it's not always enjoyable to think about your family's history and past. There's some things that we even prefer to cover up. But in the Bible, it seems that there is no scandalous detail or story that has been excluded. If we read the Bible, we see many failings and even shameful stories of some of the most important characters of the Christian faith. Now, today we are going to consider one Bible character that is not very well known, but someone that fulfilled a purpose very important in the history of God's people, despite her scandalous background. Now, her name is Rahab, and she appears in several books of the Bible and is almost always referred to as Rahab the prostitute, except for one place in the Bible, and that's in the book of Matthew, in the genealogy of Jesus. She is just Rahab. Rahab, one of the ancestors of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, last week, Nate spoke about Joshua and his life of faith and courage. In the Bible passage that we're about to read, we're going to read about Joshua preparing his people, God's people, Israel, to enter the promised land. And before they can take possession of this land, they must fight their enemies, the Canaanites, starting with the city of Jericho. Now, there's a famous story about the city of Jericho and its defeat and how God was able to destroy the city with the walls falling after they marched around it. But sometimes we don't know this story about what happened before the walls fell. So we're going to read in Joshua chapter 2, we're going to read the entire chapter, starting in verse 1. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. "Go, look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab, "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them." But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what you are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She said to them, "Go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way." Now the men had said to her, "This oath you made us swear will not be binding on us, unless when you enter the land you have tied the scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house. If any of them go outside your house into the street, their blood will be on their own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear." "Agreed," she replied. "Let it be as you say." So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. When they left, they went into the hills and stayed there 3 days, until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them. Then the 2 men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us." Now the city of Jericho in the land of Canaan was a very important city. It was a very important city, a city that was fortified. It was prepared for battle. It was the first city that the Israelites would come to as they entered the promised land. Now there was no way that the Israelites would be able to defeat this city without God's help, without God's intervention. And for that reason, Joshua sent 2 spies to check out the land, to view the land, and also to see who they'd be dealing with. That led them to the home of Rahab. Now, it's interesting that they would have chosen the house of a prostitute for refuge. But if we think about it, it was not uncommon during that time for travelers and foreigners to look for refuge, for obvious reasons, in a brothel or the house of a prostitute. And regardless of this detail, it's obvious that God's hand was on these spies, and God's hand was also on Rahab and her entire family. We can see this in the way that all the Canaanites were already terrified because of the Israelites. They had heard the stories of how God had saved Israel from slavery in Egypt, how he helped them cross the Red Sea, how he had given them victory in the desert over their enemies. So they were already speaking about Israel and very afraid of their arrival. Now, not only does Rahab receive these foreigners into her home, but she also deceives the king so that they are not found and so they can escape from the city. In return for her help, the spies agree that she and her family will be spared from the coming destruction of the city. And the family of Rahab is identified by a scarlet cord that they would tie to the window of their home. And after the defeat of Jericho, we see this promise fulfilled. We see that Rahab and her family are not only saved, but they're also invited to become a part of the nation of Israel. This is a very interesting story. It's fascinating. And there are many things that we can learn about God through the life of Rahab. This morning, I'm going to give 3 lessons that we can take from this passage and from Rahab's life. The first lesson is that our pasts do not determine our future. Our pasts, whatever they might be, do not determine the future that we will have. Now, throughout the Bible, not just in Joshua, but throughout the Bible, Rahab is referred to as a prostitute or a harlot. Now, this was unfortunately a common profession during this period of history. But it wasn't because Rahab was necessarily more immoral than other people. The main motivation for a woman to become a prostitute was due to some type of financial need, whether she had been born into poverty or whether she was a widow who had lost a husband. It didn't necessarily mean that it was her lifelong aspiration to become a prostitute or that she was simply immoral. For many women, it was the only option that they saw in order to survive. It appears also that Rahab was single, without children, as there's no mention of her having a husband or children in her family when she mentions her family. She would have been looked down upon by her own people and forced to live on the margins of society. And that's why we see that her house is not in the center of the city. It's a part of the wall. It's a part of the margins. In a sense, her own people are saying, you belong outside or close to outside of our city. Now, despite that, her home, as we come to find out, is a perfect place for 2 Israelite spies to hide out. In the wall, where foreigners would have been common to stay in that home. And despite this past that Rahab has come to believe that the God of Israel is the one true God. And we see that as she declares this truth, and not only declares that this God is the one true God and all-powerful God, but she seeks mercy through these spies. So despite Rahab's profession and how she was seen in her own society, God does not just see a Canaanite prostitute, but rather God sees a woman of faith. A woman of faith who he wants to adopt into his family. A woman of faith with a special purpose that no one would have ever expected. A special purpose to be a part of God's great plan of salvation. Now, in some ways, if we've read through the Bible, this should not surprise us. In Romans 10, verse 12 through 13, it states, "For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile." There's no difference between Jew and non-Jews. "The same Lord is Lord of all, and richly blesses all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." Everyone, whether they're a prostitute or a business owner or a politician or a baker, whatever country they're from, whatever race they belong to, all who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. Even a Canaanite woman such as Rahab, who in a sense came to believe and called upon the Lord through these spies who represent God and his people. In James, I lost my place for a moment. The second lesson, the first lesson is that our past don't determine our future. The second lesson in the life of Rahab is that God's goodness comes to us through faith. Now, Rahab recognized who God was, and by faith, she pleaded for mercy and even risked her own life by hiding these spies and misleading the king's men. Now, her actions did not earn God's mercy. We might think, well, she did a favor for Israel, so now God will do a favor for her. But there's more than that. Her actions in hiding these spies and declaring who God was, they declare her faith. They demonstrate Rahab's faith in God. Now listen to what Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, says about Rahab. In chapter 11, verse 31, it says, "By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient." So it was her faith that is what led to her salvation. But her faith was demonstrated through her actions. And this is what we see in the book of James, where he also mentions Rahab, where he adds that true faith is always connected to actions such as those of Rahab. James 2:24 through 26 says, "You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do, and not by faith alone. In the same way was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead." This faith led to the salvation of Rahab, and not just for her entire family. They were all saved from the defeat of Jericho. And she did not only declare with her mouth God's greatness, but she revealed her faith by risking her own life to save these spies. Now, there's many times we say we believe in something or we have faith, but if we truly have faith, it will be demonstrated in some action in our lives. If we say that it's just like if we say we love somebody, but there's no indication, there's no evidence that we actually show love to that person, maybe that love isn't true. Or if we say that we believe in God, but it doesn't affect our life in any way, is it truly faith? All true faith reveals itself with actions in some way. And when we live out our faith, like Rahab lived out her faith in this God that she barely knew, it will always bring more of God's goodness into our lives. It will bring more of God's blessing, and not just to us. It will bring more of God's blessing to those around us, our families, our friends, others. Rahab didn't just save herself. She saved her whole family, her brothers, sisters, and parents. But God's goodness came to her through her faith, that she came to believe, and her faith was lived out by taking an incredible risk. Now, the last lesson that I want to share this morning is that God's redemption changes our life direction. God's redemption changes our life direction. Now, Rahab had little possibility of changing her situation in life. She had no other options. It's easy to assume. Otherwise, she would have found a different line of work. Otherwise, she would have done something different. We don't know the circumstances of how she came to be a prostitute, but I'm sure there was a lot of pain and suffering in her journey to come to that position. She had little possibility of changing her situation in life. She had been a prostitute living on the margins of her city, of her society. And she also belonged to a nation that would soon be defeated, that would soon be conquered, a city that would be destroyed. So it seems that for Rahab, her destiny was that her life would end in certain tragedy, in defeat, in death. However, God had a different plan for Rahab, a different plan for her family. And her faith in God's mercy changed everything. Changed everything for her and her family. God transformed Rahab from a scorned prostitute to a hero of God's people. She was not only spared from death, but she was also adopted into God's family, welcomed into God's family, celebrated even. Listen to the final mention of Rahab in the book of Joshua, in chapter 6, verse 25. After all of Israel arrived to Jericho and they marched around the walls, and in a miraculous way, the walls collapsed and the city was to be taken. We see this in Joshua 6:25. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. It's a short phrase with great implications. She was not only spared, but she was invited in to God's people to be a part, her and her family. And when this book was written, the book of Joshua was written, she remained a part of that family, her and all her family. Now, Canaan may have been defeated, and sometimes it's difficult to read through these parts of the Bible and to understand why God would use his people to defeat these other nations. Sometimes it's difficult to understand why they took this land, and there's a lot to be said about that. But it's important to know that even though Israel defeated Canaan, that God's greater plan has always been to bless all peoples through Israel. Listen to God's words to Abraham. When God made a covenant with Abraham and chose him to turn into a great nation, his plan was never to only bless that one nation. Listen to what God says to Abraham in Genesis 12:3. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." There's another version that says all families on earth will be blessed through you. So God's intention with creating the nation of Israel from Abraham, was not only to create one people for himself, rather it was to bless all people of the world, to bless all families. We see a picture of this in the life of Rahab, someone that didn't belong to the nation of Israel, someone that wasn't even very well respected in her own nation, her own culture. But God chooses her to be blessed and be a part of his family. God desires that all people come to him through faith in Jesus. Because this promise to bless all people and all families ultimately is fulfilled in Jesus. He desires all people to come to him through faith in Jesus, and that they be adopted into his family, just as Rahab was. Rahab did not know of Jesus when she came to believe in the God of Israel. But hundreds of years later, when Jesus was born on earth, he would become one of her descendants. As we find Rahab in the very genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, we find that Rahab isn't referred there as a prostitute. Rather, she is referred to as one of the ancestors of Jesus through the line of Joseph, Jesus' father. So she was not only adopted into the family of God, she became a part of the very lineage of Jesus, who would bless all peoples and all families through faith. Now, in conclusion to this message, I'd like to close with a story that's always impacted me and how I see God's love. There was a pastor and an author named Tony Campolo, and he tells a story. It's actually fairly famous. You may have heard it before. But he tells this story about how he was traveling by plane, and he arrived far away in a different time zone. in the middle of the night. And even though it was late, he couldn't sleep. So he decided to leave his hotel and look for something to eat. Unfortunately, there wasn't very many places that were open in the middle of the night. So he walked down a street and he eventually found a small diner or restaurant that was dirty and didn't look very nice. But he entered and went to the bar and sat down and ordered a cup of coffee and a donut. And as he was drinking his coffee and eating his donut, a loud group of women entered the restaurant. And they were all very provocatively dressed. And soon Tony found himself surrounded by these women sitting on his right and on his left. And he felt fairly uncomfortable. But instead of leaving, he became interested in their conversation. As one of these women, who he realized were all prostitutes, one of these women began to talk about how the next day would be her birthday. And she said, I've never had a birthday party in my life. And her friend said, well, what do you want me to do? Throw you a birthday party? And she laughed at her. And she became sad and said, you don't need to be mean. And as Tony was listening to this conversation, an idea occurred to him. And as these ladies left the restaurant, he called over the manager. And he told the manager, he asked about this woman who was preparing to have her birthday. And the manager said, oh, Agnes. Yeah, Agnes comes in here every night at the same time. And Tony said to the manager, what do you think about us throwing a party for Agnes? I heard that she's never had a birthday party before. And the manager thought, he said, that's a great idea. And he called over his wife, who also worked in the restaurant, and she loved the idea too. And they began to make plans and to invite people. And they said, Agnes is actually a very nice person, very kind, who's always helping people. This is great that we can do something for her. So the next day, Tony returned to the restaurant and he decorated the restaurant from top to bottom. It no longer looked like a dirty little diner or restaurant. And they bought a birthday cake for Agnes. And soon, at 3 a.m, the restaurant was filled with prostitutes from the area that knew Agnes and filled with people that knew Agnes as well. And when Agnes walked in at 3 a.m. and heard everyone shout, "Happy birthday," she couldn't believe it. She was in shock, and tears began to run down her face as they sang happy birthday to her. And as they brought Agnes her birthday cake and gave her a knife to cut the cake, she stopped and hesitated and looked at the cake and said, "Please, is it okay if I bring this cake home? I live close and I want to show it to my mom, to my mother." And I said, "Of course, you can take the cake. Go ahead. We'll wait for you." So Agnes left, and everyone was standing in this dirty restaurant in silence. They didn't know what to say. And Tony thought that it was the right moment to say a prayer. So he asked permission and prayed. He prayed for Agnes. He prayed for healing in her life, for all the hard things she must have experienced. He prayed for her to know God. And when he finished his prayer, the manager approached him and said, "You never said you were a preacher. What kind of church do you belong to?" And Tony stopped and he said, "I belong to the kind of church that throws birthday parties at 3:30 in the morning for prostitutes." And the manager looked at him and he said, "No, you don't, because that church doesn't exist. But if it did, I would even go to a church like that." And Tony closes this story by stating that Jesus came to create the kind of church that throws birthday parties for prostitutes like Agnes. The kind of church that invites people like Rahab to be a part of that family. The kind of church that welcomes and accepts people that society has rejected and society has found as less than desirable. That's the kind of church that Jesus has come to create. The kind of church that loves people no matter who they are and what their background is. The people that are just willing to come by faith. Those are the people that God loves and desires to be part of his family. Let's take a moment to pray. Lord Jesus, thank you. Thank you for coming to create a church that loves in a way that we can hardly even believe. Thank you. Thank you for finding a way to save Rahab and her family. Thank you for your impact on the life of Agnes, on us. Help us to not be afraid of her past or her mistakes, but to come to you with faith and to be loved and to be accepted. And understand that you're the kind of God that throws parties for the least expected people. Jesus, help us to be that kind of church that welcomes people, that loves people, that guides them to know you no matter what their story is. Help us to be welcoming and loving just as you are. We pray these things, Jesus, in your name. The one last detail I wanted to add about that story about Agnes, it's on the internet, and I was reading the story to prepare for this message, and you kind of wonder, what happened to Agnes? What happened to her? How did it impact this story? How did it impact her? Rahab, we know what happened. Agnes, what do we know about Agnes? And I found online there was an update on Agnes, and it said that her and Tony stayed in touch over the years, and that Agnes eventually left her job as a prostitute and actually went to work in a small restaurant, the same one where her birthday party had happened. And not only that, but this pastor, Tony, who traveled a lot to different places to speak, went to one speaking engagement that was on his birthday. And when he arrived to that city, the speaking engagement, there's a big sign that said, "Happy Birthday," with the name of Agnes below it. Agnes decided that she wanted to repay the favor to this person that threw her first birthday party, and I'm sure it wasn't her last. So we should never underestimate God's power to change somebody's life through his love. And we should never underestimate God's power working through us to love others and to share his love with others.